Hi, this is Dr. Michael Bogart of Aspect Ministries, where we're all about promoting effective 21st century faith. In my previous video on the Chosen series, I explained some of the Jewish groups that Jesus encountered in the Gospels: Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, and Zealots. It's hard to keep them all straight, I know, much less understand why, even though they were so different and even at odds with one another at times, they nevertheless became united in their hatred of Jesus. Now, in a moment, I'll continue to explain the remaining groups: Scribes, tax collectors, Essenes, and the Sanhedrin. But as always, I need to remind new viewers about the overall problem with watching this Chosen series. You know, it's not the Chosen itself. Believe me, I'm a big fan. But it's the fact that 2,000 years have passed since Jesus' times. So many changes have taken place since then. Now, many layers of culture and history separate us from what we read in the gospel accounts of Jesus' life. A 21st century person living in a very different time and culture naturally struggles a bit with understanding the customs and historical setting of the gospel accounts. These videos simply attempt to explain some of the things that prevent a full appreciation of the Chosen and of the Gospels themselves. So let's jump into it. Who were the Scribes, tax collectors, and Essenes? And what is this thing called the Sanhedrin? We'll start with the Scribes. Some of you may be familiar with the Jewish exile that I talked about in my previous video. Let me do a short recap for those who aren't familiar with it. From 606 to 536 BC, the Jews who survived the invasion and conquest of Judah by the Babylonians were forced into exile in Babylon. After 536, many Jews chose to return to Jerusalem when Cyrus the Persian, who had conquered the Babylonians, allowed Jews to return. The returned exiles were very conscious that in the years leading up to the exile, the prophets had warned Israel that they would be judged for their failing to keep the covenant that God had made with them at Mount Sinai. So a small core of them were determined to keep the law without wavering. They became the group known as the Pharisees. But how can people keep the law and the covenant if they don't even know what it says? They can't, unless they have access to the Scriptures, where the written law is recorded and explained. The need to make the written law widely available to the people after the exile prompted a priest called Ezra to found a school for scribes in the 400s BC. These scribes were trained to accurately and painstakingly copy the Scriptures, what Christians today know as the Old Testament. The returned exiles rebuilt the temple and resumed worship there. But while the rebuilt temple was still important after the exile, a new institution came into wide use: the synagogue. In the synagogues, people gathered in their local communities to pray and hear the Scriptures read. But hundreds of synagogues sprang up in places where Jews were scattered all over the ancient world, which required many, many copies of the Scriptures to be made available. Now remember, each copy of the Old Testament was laboriously copied by hand, taking maybe a year to finish. Hence the need for a class of people called scribes. These men initially focused on copying Scripture and then reading it aloud in the synagogues during Shabbat services. But because they were trained in writing later, they also were needed to produce legal documents, record land and inheritance deeds, marriage contracts, certificates of divorce, etc. They could also serve as notaries and compose personal documents for people. Just think of lawyers and clerks in our own day. As a class, scribes were also hostile to Jesus and participated in harassing and entrapping him. Now, I definitely need to mention the publicans, also known as tax collectors. Matthew the tax collector, for instance, features prominently in every episode so far in the Chosen series. These publicans were people who were absolutely despised by the average Jewish person. Why? While people today don't necessarily like being taxed, we don't usually hate people who work for the various government entities that levy those taxes. Well, picture your country occupied by a foreign power who treats you as conquered and subservient subjects. Picture them imposing huge taxes on you that went mostly to enrich their own officials and finance their occupation forces. You're literally paying them to mistreat and dominate you. Now picture some of your own countrymen working for these hated occupiers, actually making sure that you paid these taxes and even adding a fat surcharge that they put into their own pockets. Would that make you pretty angry? Well, of course, I think it would. That was the Jewish publican or tax collector, and one of them became a disciple of Jesus. His Jewish name was Levi, but he was more commonly known by his public name of Matthew, the writer of the first gospel. Now, can you imagine the tricky relationship Matthew must have had with Simon the Zealot? Talk about being on opposite sides of the political divide. I'm sure they had to work overtime to resolve their differences. It says a lot about the power of Jesus, that two such different men could both love and follow him, and as a result learn to love one another as Jesus commanded. Though they're not mentioned by name in the Gospels, the Essenes were a significant group among first century Jews as well. They were intensely religious and seem to have considered other Jews of all stripes as compromisers and sellouts. Essenes lived in isolated and exclusive communities apart from society, often in the desert regions of the Holy Land, such as at the northwest corner of the Dead Sea in the Qumran community. They practiced celibacy, communal living, daily ritual purification. They took in orphan children and kept at least one very famous library, which has survived to the present time, the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in some caves near Qumran. Now, we owe the Essenes a great debt, because the Dead Sea Scrolls have shown that the Old Testament that we have in our possession today is essentially the same as the scriptures that the Essenes had in their library 2,000 years ago. So contrary to what critics of the Bible have claimed, there really were no significant copy deviations in the Old Testament for more than 20 centuries. While the Essenes are not mentioned by name in the New Testament, their presence seems to be implied in certain passages. For instance, 1 Timothy 4:3 may refer to them when it speaks of people who forbid people to marry and order them to abstain from certain foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and who know the truth. Kind of sounds like the Essenes, but who knows for sure since the writer doesn't really give these people a name. Some even theorize that John the Baptist may have been associated with the Essenes in some way. I mean, he lived in the same region of the desert, he baptized with water, he was strict in his lifestyle and so forth. But then again, John seems to have been pretty much a lone wolf and not representing anyone but himself in the message of the coming Messiah. Finally, let's take a quick look at the Sanhedrin, also called the Great Sanhedrin. It was sort of like the Supreme Court of Israel in that it made final and irrevocable decisions about Jewish life. The Sanhedrin was a mixed group of Pharisees, Sadducees, and others. It was composed of 71 members called judges who heard cases referred to them by lower Jewish courts. In Jesus' time, the Sanhedrin met regularly in the Hall of Hewn Stones in the Jerusalem Temple. The Sanhedrin seems to have worked with the high priest of Israel, which in Jesus' time was a person named Caiaphas. As a fascinating side note, the coffin or bone box of Caiaphas was found in 1990, and clearly written on the side of this limestone box is the name Kapha, or as we say it, Caiaphas. So once again, we find the Bible to be accurate in terms of the people and events it describes. So why were these groups so hostile to Jesus and his message? As I mentioned in my previous video, at the time of Jesus, Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, and others held enormous authority and power over the Jewish people. Likewise, the scribes had a near monopoly over written documents, how they were read, and who could read them. The Sanhedrin had near absolute rule over Jewish religious matters of all kinds. Each of these groups held tightly to their power and sensed Jesus to be a threat to all that they enjoyed. But this is only part of the picture, because Jesus actually went out of his way to provoke them. He repeatedly called these groups out as oppressive, manipulative, corrupt, and even as enemies of God. Listen to some of his own words taken from Matthew chapter 23. Listen to this. I think you'll be shocked. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you've succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. He goes on. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you're full of hypocrisy and wickedness. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Just as a side note, on one of my trips to Israel, in the very synagogue of Capernaum, the synagogue right where Jesus must have met these people, I saw a viper, a Palestinian viper, very poisonous. And I thought to myself, wow, I wonder if Jesus said that right on this spot. One of those coincidences. But it's no wonder that they were angry with Jesus. Mark 3:6 records their reaction to this rebuke. It says, "Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus." So was Jesus being unfair towards these people? I mean, what he said was pretty harsh. But what if his accusations were true? What if they really were corrupt, self-serving elitists who had a stranglehold over the common Jewish people? What if they had no real inner connection to God and even prevented people from establishing such a connection for themselves? If that were the case, then what Jesus said is not unfair, but a much-needed calling out of a small group who were oppressing everybody else. That's something 21st century people might want to think about. All right, in the next background video, I want to take a closer look at the Roman occupation of the Holy Land in Jesus' time and why that played such a huge role in the events of his life and ministry. And of course, how that works out in the Chosen series. I think you'll see God's hand in that part of history and find correlations with how God's working in our own times. In the meantime, don't forget to check out my other videos on YouTube, like my 5-minute Bible guides, in which I give simple but impactful chunks of information about the Bible and related topics. Also, take a moment to visit my websites, aspectministries.com and undiscoveredbible.com. I think you'll find an array of helpful and thought-provoking articles, media, and more there that really will enhance your walk with God. I hope my insights in this episode have been enlightening and have deepened both your appreciation and your enjoyment of the Chosen series. As I said, I'm a big fan. And it would help if you'd be so kind as to like and subscribe to this channel. Till next time, this is Dr. Michael Bogart with Aspect Ministries. I'll see you then.